All right, so you started your compost pile, now what? One thing to be thinking about is temperature. Now there's kind of two main kinds of composting. There's what we call cold and what we call hot. Cold is not very involved. You essentially put your yard clippings, everything in a nice pile, and you let it be for about a year. That means the process in which it breaks down is really slow. You don't have to worry about it. It's a very easy way to compost, but it's also a very long way to compost. If you want a more involved, immediate return, you can do what we call hot composting. And that's essentially building heat in the compost pile that all the microbes and critters in there are releasing that heat. You don't have to, put it next to a heater. It'll do the work itself. And that heat shows signs of decomposition, right? So how do you measure the heat? Well, here at Food Love, we have a fancy-dancy thermometer. Right now it's reading 120 degrees. That's awesome. That's a really good range for it to be. Do you need one at home? Absolutely not. One way to tell if it's hot, open it up. Is it steaming? Does it feel hot? Those are great ways to find out if your compost is hot. Don't be intimidated by gadgets or tools like this. They're helpful, they're fun, but they're not necessary to starting your compost pile. Another thing to think about when maintaining your compost pile is moisture. Is it too wet or is it too dry? I mentioned earlier about critters as signs whether or not it's too wet or too dry. You can also just look at it. Your eyes are your best tool for maintaining your compost pile. So if it's looking goopy and if it's stinky, your nose is also a great tool. If it's stinky, it's too wet. It needs more brown, dry materials. If it's cold and dry, it needs more green materials and more water. So it's just a balancing act between wet and dry, cold and hot. And it's hungry, so you always need to feed it. The 4 ingredients to a healthy compost pile are nitrogen, which is greens, carbon, which is browns materials, air, and water. As long as you have those 4 things, you will get a healthy compost pile. So if you're making a hot compost pile, do you have to turn it? Turning it helps speed up the process of decomposition. So if you're wanting your compost sooner rather than later, it's a good idea to turn it. Now, turning is a really intimidating concept. Where do I turn it into? How much do I turn it? Is there a certain direction in which I should flop the stuff over? It's a lot. Basically, turning it, think about getting air into your compost pile. I like to use a pitchfork because it really brings up the materials. If you don't have one, use a shovel. And it's all about fluffing it up. So you can think of a salad. You put your dressing on, but to really make sure that dressing gets on all the different bits, you want to toss the salad, right? You can also toss your compost pile. It doesn't need to be exact. It's just a way to kind of integrate and mix up all the pieces as well as fluff it up. So how to know when your compost is ready? So your compost is ready when it's a nice kind of rich dark brown material. Perhaps you've heard the word black gold before. That refers to really rich nutrient dense compost that's ready to be applied to your garden. In terms of texture, you want it a little bit crumbly, still moist, because if it's not wet at all, that means it's not alive. But it should have sticks in it. It could even have a few eggshells left. This is not some perfect, sandy dirt. It's alive, it's textured. So it doesn't need to be smooth, but you want to make sure that you can squeeze it and it kind of keeps a form. You want it still warm to the touch. But compost is never really done. It's living, so it's always evolving, but there's a stage in which it's ready to be put on your bed. That's usually a uniform color and kind of a rich, crumbly texture. And also if you smell it, it should have an earthy smell. It shouldn't be smelling rotten or diseased. It should be smelling good, something that you'd want to feed to your plants. So when your compost is ready, it's time to put it on your garden. I like to put between 1 inch and 3 inches on the top layer of my beds. That's a good measure. It's really up to you. It depends on how much you have. So if you have a lot, you can give a heartier dose. If you have a little bit, make sure all your beds get some compost. A nice even spread. It doesn't have to be perfect. Some people like to mix it in a little bit with your topsoil. Others like to leave it just there and plant directly in. It's up to you. Just see what works. The difference between home compost and vermicompost has to do with worms. Your home compost pile will have a bunch of worms naturally in it, but vermicomposting is centered around worms, and not just any worms, but those red wiggler worms I talked about. They are experts at quickly decomposing your kitchen scraps and aerating the soil and pooping out nutrient-dense worm castings, we call them. So vermicomposting really centers around worms. We have one over here at Food Love. It's a bin. They need to be fed regularly. We don't put too many weeds in it. It's mostly food scraps and some browns that we like to use, shredded paper. So it really focuses on the red wiggler worms and food scraps rather than so much other garden and yard waste materials.
If you want help building your compost pile at home, you can go to sierraharvest.org and sign up for a home garden consultation with me, Farmer Emily. Stay tuned on the Sierra Harvest Facebook page or our website for updates on what's going to be happening this summer.